The sun hung low over the small diner on Route 9, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt parking lot. It was the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee and locals grabbed breakfast on Saturday mornings. Nothing fancy, just honest food and worn leather booths that had seen decades of stories unfold. Jake Morrison sat in the corner booth, his leather jacket draped over the seat beside him. The Bandidos patch on his back told anyone who cared to notice exactly who he was. But Jake wasn't there looking for attention. He was just a man grabbing a late lunch after a long ride through the back roads, trying to clear his head after a rough week. The waitress, Carol, brought him his usual burger, fries, black coffee. She'd been working there for 15 years and knew most of the regulars by name and order. Jake nodded his thanks and she walked away, letting him eat in peace. That's when he noticed the boy. Small, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sandy blonde hair that needed a cut. He sat 3 booths down with a woman Jake assumed was his mother. The kid wore leg braces, metal supports that ran from his shoes to just below his knees. His movements were careful, deliberate, as he shifted in his seat. But it wasn't the braces that caught Jake's attention. It was the bruise, dark purple, spreading across the woman's cheekbone like spilled ink. She tried to hide it, angling her face away from other diners, but Jake had seen enough violence in his life to recognize the signs. Her hands trembled slightly as she pushed food around her plate, barely eating. The boy noticed Jake looking. Their eyes met for just a second, long enough for Jake to see something old and tired in those young eyes. Something no kid should carry. Jake turned back to his burger, but the image stuck with him. He'd been riding with the Bandidos for 12 years. He'd seen broken bones and broken spirits. He knew what domestic violence looked like, and it was sitting 3 booths away from him, trying to pretend everything was normal. He was halfway through his meal when the boy appeared beside his table. Jake looked down, surprised. The kid had moved quietly despite the braces, hobbling over when his mother had excused herself to the restroom. In his small hands he clutched something, a toy car, blue and battered, with one wheel missing and a crack running down the middle. "Mister," the boy whispered, his voice so quiet Jake almost didn't hear it. Jake set down his burger. "Hey there, buddy, what's up?" The boy glanced over his shoulder, checking to make sure his mother was still gone, then pushed the broken toy across the table toward Jake. His hands were shaking. "I want you to have this," the boy said. Jake frowned, confused. "That's real nice of you, kid, but I can't take your toy. Don't you want to keep it?" The boy's eyes filled with tears, and his bottom lip quivered. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping even lower, barely more than a breath. "He smashed it," the boy whispered, "and he hurts my mom too." Time seemed to stop. Jake's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. The diner sounds, clattering dishes, conversation, the sizzle of the grill, all faded into background static. All he could hear was the boy's voice echoing in his head. "He hurts my mom too." Jake looked into the kid's eyes and saw raw, desperate fear. This wasn't a child seeking attention or exaggerating. This was a plea for help from someone too small and too scared to fight back. "What's your name, son?" Jake asked gently. "Tommy," the boy whispered. "Tommy, who smashed your car?" "My stepdad, Rick. He gets really mad. He threw it against the wall when I was playing too loud, and when Mom tried to stop him, Tommy's voice broke. "Please, I don't know what to do. Nobody listens. Nobody helps." Jake felt something ignite in his chest, a cold, controlled anger that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with justice. He'd spent years riding alongside men who lived by a code, protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And here was a disabled kid, hobbling over to a stranger in a diner, handing him a broken toy as a cry for help because he had nowhere else to turn. "Where do you live, Tommy?" Jake asked quietly. Tommy rattled off an address. Jake committed it to memory immediately. "Listen to me very carefully," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "You did the right thing coming to me. You're a brave kid, braver than most adults I know. Can you go back to your mom now and pretend we just talked about your toy car? Can you do that?" Tommy nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Good. And Tommy, things are going to change. I promise you that. but you need to be strong for one more night. Can you do that for me?" "Yes, sir," Tommy whispered. The boy took the broken car back, Jake insisted, knowing it might look suspicious if he kept it, and limped back to his booth just as his mother returned from the restroom. She sat down, glancing at her son with worried eyes, but Tommy just smiled at her and went back to his food. Jake watched them for another minute. The mother looked exhausted, defeated, the kind of tired that comes from living in constant fear. And Tommy sat there with his broken toy in his lap, pretending everything was fine. Jake pushed his plate away. His appetite was gone. He stood up, threw cash on the table, enough to cover his meal and a generous tip for Carol, and walked out of the diner without looking back. Outside, the evening air hit him like a wall. He stood beside his Harley for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to process what just happened. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed. The phone rang twice before Marcus "Tank" Johnson answered. "Jake? What's up, brother?" "Tank, I need you to make some calls," Jake said, his voice tight and controlled. "Call everyone. Every chapter within 200 miles. I need boots on the ground tomorrow morning." There was a pause on the other end. Tank had been Jake's riding partner for over a decade. They'd been through enough together that Tank knew when Jake was serious. "What happened?" Tank asked, his tone shifting to match Jake's intensity. "Found a kid, 7 years old, disabled, living with a piece of garbage who's beating him and his mother. Kid came up to me in a diner and asked for help, Tank. Handed me his broken toy and told me his stepdad smashed it and hurts his mom." Tank let out a long breath. "Give me the address." Jake recited Tommy's address from memory. "I'm making calls now," Tank said. "How many you want?" "Everyone who can ride. I want a show of force. I want this scumbag to understand that what he's been doing stops today. And I want that kid and his mother to know they're protected." "You got it, brother. I'll have numbers by midnight. Where are we meeting?" "Thompson's gas station on Route 9. 6 a.m. sharp. We roll out together. I'll spread the word." "Jake, you sure about this? This is going to be big." Jake looked back at the diner, where through the window he could still see Tommy and his mother sitting in their booth. The boy was trying to smile, trying to be normal, but the fear was still there, lurking behind his eyes. "I've never been more sure about anything in my life," Jake said. "This is exactly why we wear these patches. This is what brotherhood means." "You got that right, brother. See you tomorrow." Jake hung up and stood in the parking lot for another few minutes, watching the diner. Eventually, he saw Tommy and his mother stand up to leave. The woman helped her son with his braces, and they walked slowly toward an old sedan parked near the entrance. She kept glancing around nervously, as if expecting someone to jump out at them. Jake waited until they drove away before he mounted his Harley and headed home. The ride back was a blur. His mind was already working through logistics, thinking about what needed to happen tomorrow. The Bandidos operated on respect and loyalty. When one member called for help, everyone answered. It was the code they lived by. By the time Jake pulled into his driveway, his phone was already buzzing with messages. Tank had worked fast. Messages flooded his phone from chapter presidents, road captains, and brothers he hadn't heard from in months. Everyone was in. The word had spread like wildfire through the network, and the response was overwhelming. "Count me in. Rolling out at 4 a.m. Got 12 guys from my chapter ready to ride. We're 3 hours away, but we'll be there. This is what we do, brother. See you tomorrow." Jake sat on his couch that night, scrolling through the messages, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not for himself, but for Tommy and his mother. For all the people who lived in fear behind closed doors, thinking no one cared. Tomorrow they'd see that someone did care. By midnight, Tank sent the final count. 412 riders committed. Some were coming from neighboring states. Others were local chapters who'd heard the call and dropped everything to answer. 412 brothers, united for one purpose. Jake barely slept that night. He kept seeing Tommy's face, kept hearing those words. "He hurts my mom too." At 4:30 a.m., Jake was already awake, dressed and ready. He pulled on his leather vest, the Bandidos patch prominent on his back, and headed to Thompson's gas station. Even though he was early, he wasn't the first to arrive. Tank was already there, along with 20 other riders. More were pulling in every minute. The rumble of Harley engines filling the early morning air. Headlights cut through the darkness as bike after bike rolled into the lot. By 5:30, the gas station was packed. Bikes lined up in rows and the air smelled of leather, oil, and coffee from the station's convenience store. Riders stood in groups, talking quietly, checking their bikes, preparing for the ride. Jake walked through the crowd, shaking hands, nodding to familiar faces and new ones. These were men, and a few women from all walks of life: mechanics, teachers, business owners, veterans, people who'd chosen this lifestyle because it meant something, because it stood for something: brotherhood, loyalty, protection. At 5:50, Jake climbed onto the hood of Tank's truck and called for attention. The crowd fell silent, hundreds of eyes turning toward him. "Brothers and sisters," Jake began, his voice carrying across the lot. "Thank you for being here. Yesterday I met a kid named Tommy. He's 7 years old, wears leg braces, and lives with a man who's been beating him and his mother. This kid hobbled up to me in a diner and handed me his broken toy, broken because his stepdad smashed it in a fit of rage, and asked me for help." The crowd was absolutely silent now. You could have heard a pin drop. "Today we're going to answer that call," Jake continued. "We're going to show Tommy and his mother that they're not alone. We're going to show this coward who's been hurting them that his reign of terror is over, and we're going to do it the right way. No violence, no threats, just presence. Just a show of force that says, we're watching, and this stops now." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "We ride in formation. We stay calm. We stay united. Are you with me?" The response was deafening. Shouts of, "Yeah, and let's ride," echoed across the gas station. At 6 a.m. sharp, 412 motorcycles fired up in unison. The sound was thunderous, a rolling wave of mechanical fury that shook the ground and announced to the world that something significant was happening. Jake took point, with Tank riding beside him, and the massive convoy of bikes pulled out onto Route 9. They rode in formation, 2 columns stretching back for nearly a mile. The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting golden light across the road. People in passing cars pulled over to watch, some taking videos with their phones, others just staring in awe at the sheer number of riders moving together with military precision. Inside their homes along the route, people came to their windows drawn by the sound. Some waved, others just watched, sensing that something important was unfolding. Jake led the convoy through town, following the route to Tommy's neighborhood. It was a modest area, small houses with chain-link fences and cars that had seen better days. Working-class families trying to get by. As they turned onto Tommy Street, Jake raised his hand and the convoy slowed. He pointed to the curb, and one by one, the bikes began to park. They lined both sides of the street, stretching from one end of the block to the other. Engines shut off in sequence, and suddenly the thunderous roar was replaced by silence. 412 riders dismounted and stood beside their bikes, facing Tommy's house. The house itself was unremarkable. A small, single-story structure with peeling paint and an overgrown lawn. A rusted sedan sat in the driveway. The curtains were drawn, and from the outside, it looked like any other house on the block. But Jake knew better. Behind those walls, a child lived in fear. Not anymore. The front door opened slowly, and a man appeared. Rick. He was in his 30s, stocky, with a beer gut and a stained undershirt. His face was red and puffy, and he looked like he'd just rolled out of bed. When he saw the wall of bikers standing in his street, his expression shifted from confusion to anger to fear in rapid succession. "What is going on here?" Rick shouted, stepping onto his porch. "You can't just park here. This is harassment. I'm calling the cops." Jake stepped forward, separating himself from the group. He walked calmly up the path toward Rick's porch, his boots crunching on the gravel. Behind him, 400 riders stood perfectly still, watching. "Call them," Jake said calmly. "In fact, we already did. They're on their way." Rick's bluster faltered. What do you want?" "We're here for Tommy," Jake said, "and his mother." Recognition flashed across Rick's face, followed by rage. "This is none of your business. That's my family. You can't—" "Actually," a voice interrupted from behind Jake, It became our business the moment you put your hands on a child. Jake turned to see two police cruisers pulling up at the end of the street. Officers Martinez and Dawson stepped out, along with two social workers Jake recognized from previous community outreach events the Bandidos had participated in. Rick's face went pale. Officer Martinez walked up to the porch, nodding respectfully to Jake before turning to Rick. "Mr. Henderson, we've received multiple reports of domestic violence at this address. We need to speak with you and your family." "This is because of them," Rick pointed at the bikers. "They're intimidating me. This is illegal." "They're parked legally on a public street," Officer Dawson said calmly. "Now we can do this easy or we can do it hard, but we're going to talk to Tommy and his mother. Step aside." Rick looked like he wanted to argue, but the sight of 400 bikers standing in silent solidarity seemed to drain the fight out of him. He stepped back, and the officers entered the house. Jake stayed on the street, but he could hear voices inside. A woman crying, Tommy's small voice answering questions, the social workers speaking in calm, professional tones. 10 minutes later, the front door opened again, and Tommy appeared, holding his mother's hand. She was crying, but this time it looked like tears of relief rather than fear. Tommy saw Jake and his eyes went wide. "You came," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. "I promised you things would change," Jake said, kneeling down to Tommy's level. "We keep our promises." Behind them, Rick was being led out in handcuffs. He was shouting, cursing, making threats, but Officer Martinez just guided him firmly to the patrol car. The neighbors had come out now, standing on their porches, watching as justice unfolded on their quiet street. One of the social workers, a woman named Lisa, approached Jake. "Thank you for calling this in. We've been trying to get access to this family for months, but the mother was too scared to press charges. Today, with all of you here as witnesses, she finally felt safe enough to tell the truth." Jake nodded. "What happens now?" "Rick is being arrested on multiple charges: assault, child endangerment, domestic violence. He'll be held without bail given the severity in the witness statements. Tommy and his mother will be placed in protective services temporarily while we help them relocate to a safe environment. We have resources, counseling, legal support. They're not going back to this life." Tommy tugged on Jake's sleeve. When Jake looked down, the boy was holding the broken toy car. Can you really fix it?" Tommy asked. Jake smiled, his eyes stinging with unexpected emotion. "I can do better than that, buddy. How about we get you a whole new collection?" Tommy's face lit up, a genuine smile that transformed his features. It was the first time Jake had seen the kid look like an actual kid. What happened next was something the neighborhood would talk about for years. The bikers didn't just stand there as witnesses, they acted. Tank walked up to Jake with a handful of cash. "Brothers are pitching in," he said. "We've got about $15,000 collected in the last 10 minutes. What do you want to do with it?" Jake looked at Tommy's house, the peeling paint, the broken fence, the yard full of weeds. Then he looked at Tommy, still holding his broken toy car, standing beside his mother, who was talking to the social workers. "We're going to make things right," Jake said. Within an hour, the street had transformed into something resembling a combination of a block party and a construction site. Riders who were contractors in their day jobs started assessing what needed to be fixed. Others made runs to hardware stores and toy shops. Some organized food, bringing in grills and coolers full of drinks. The community, which had stayed silent for so long while abuse happened behind closed doors, came alive. Neighbors brought tools from their garages. A woman from 3 houses down brought fresh lemonade. An elderly man offered his truck for supply runs. Jake coordinated everything like a general directing troops. He assigned teams to different tasks: yard work, painting, fence repair. A group of riders went inside with Tommy and his mother's permission to assess what needed to be done indoors. What they found was heartbreaking. Tommy's room was barely larger than a closet. The walls were bare except for water stains. His bed was a thin mattress on the floor. He had almost no toys. The broken car had been one of the few possessions Rick hadn't destroyed or thrown away. "This changes now," said Maria, a writer who worked as an interior designer. "We're giving this kid a real room." By noon, trucks were arriving with supplies: paint, drywall, lumber, furniture. A toy store owner who'd heard about what was happening showed up with his entire delivery van full of donated toys. Action figures, building blocks, board games, and a brand new remote control car collection. Tommy watched from the porch, his eyes growing wider with each new arrival. His mother sat beside him, crying again, but these tears were different. She kept whispering, "I can't believe this is real. I can't believe you're all doing this." "Ma'am," Jake said gently, sitting down beside her, "you and your son deserve safety. You deserve happiness. And you deserve to know that there are people in this world who care about what happens to you." "I tried to leave so many times," she said, her voice breaking, "but he always found us. He always threatened. He said if I left, he'd hurt Tommy worse. I felt so trapped, so alone." "You're not alone anymore," Jake said firmly. "You see all these people? Every single one of them is here because they believe in protecting those who need it. When Tommy gets scared at night, you tell him about today. You tell him about 400 people who showed up because one brave little boy asked for help." By mid-afternoon, Tommy's room was unrecognizable. The walls were painted a cheerful blue. A proper bed frame with a new mattress stood against one wall. Shelves lined with toys and books covered another. A soft rug covered the floor. Posters of race cars and superheroes decorated the walls. A small desk with drawing supplies sat by the window. But the centerpiece, the thing that made Tommy actually cry with joy, was the massive racetrack set up in the corner. It wound around the room with loops and jumps, and lined up beside it were dozens of toy cars in every color imaginable. "Wow," Tommy whispered when they brought him in to see it. He turned to Jake with tears streaming down his face. "Is this really mine? I can keep all of this?" "Every single piece," Jake said. "And if anyone ever tries to take it from you or hurt you again, you call me." He handed Tommy a card with his phone number. "Day or night, you call me and we'll be here." Tommy threw his arms around Jake's waist, hugging him as tightly as his small frame could manage. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Jake felt his throat tighten. He patted the boy's head gently. "You're welcome, buddy. You're going to be okay now." Outside, the work continued. The yard was mowed and weeded. The fence was repaired and painted. New flowers were planted in the beds. The house's exterior got a fresh coat of paint. Loose shingles on the roof were replaced. By the time the sun started setting, the house looked completely different. It looked like a home. The neighborhood had gathered, at least 50 people from surrounding houses, watching the transformation with amazement. Some brought food to share. Children played in the street, riding their bikes around the parked motorcycles. It felt like the entire community had come together for the first time in years. Officer Martinez returned in the late afternoon with an update. "Rick is being held pending trial. The prosecutor is pursuing maximum charges. With the evidence we've collected and the witness statements, he's looking at significant prison time. And we've filed a restraining order that will remain in effect even after any sentence is served." Tommy's mother nodded, relief evident on her face. "What about housing? We can't stay here. Too many memories." Lisa, the social worker, stepped forward. "We've already arranged temporary housing for you and Tommy in a secure facility while we work on long-term placement. And the Victims Assistance Fund is covering all costs. You'll have counseling, legal support, job training if you want it, everything you need to rebuild your lives. And if you need anything at all, you have 400 brothers and sisters who have your back," Tank added, gesturing to the crowd of riders. As darkness fell, the bikers began to pack up their tools and prepare to head home. But before they left, they formed two lines, creating a path from the house to the street. Tommy and his mother walked between the two lines of bikers, each rider nodding or offering words of encouragement as they passed. "You're strong, kid. Don't forget that. Stay brave. You've got family now. We're always here if you need us." Tommy held his mother's hand with one hand and clutched a brand new toy car in the other, a shiny red sports car that Jake had given him personally. The boy's eyes shone with something that had been missing before. Hope. At the end of the line, Jake stood beside his Harley. Tommy broke free from his mother and ran to him, wrapping his arms around the biker's legs in one more tight hug. "I won't forget," Tommy said. "I won't forget any of this. When I grow up, I want to help people too, just like you." Jake crouched down one more time, looking Tommy in the eye. "You already are helping people, Tommy. You were brave enough to ask for help. That takes more courage than most adults have. You keep being that brave, and you're going to do amazing things in this life." "Will I see you again?" Tommy asked. "Count on it," Jake said. "We'll check in on you and your mom. Make sure you're both doing okay. And when you're old enough, if you want to, you can come to one of our community events. We do toy drives, fundraisers, charity rides. You could help hand out toys to other kids who need them." Tommy's face lit up. "Really? I can do that?" "Absolutely. We could use someone with your heart on the team." Tommy's mother approached, tears streaming down her face again. She looked at Jake and then at the hundreds of riders who were mounting their bikes, preparing to leave. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "All of you. You saved our lives today. Literally saved our lives." "You don't have to thank us," Jake said. "You just focus on healing and building a new life with your son. That's all the thanks we need. Seeing you both safe and happy, that's everything." She hugged him then, a desperate, grateful embrace from someone who'd been drowning and finally found solid ground. The social workers helped Tommy and his mother into a waiting car that would take them to the secure facility. As they drove away, Tommy pressed his face to the window, waving frantically at all the bikers. 400 arms rose in response, waving back. Then, in a moment that would be captured on dozens of phones and shared thousands of times on social media, all 412 bikers started their engines simultaneously. The roar was deafening. A salute, a promise, a declaration that echoed through the neighborhood and beyond. They rode out in the same formation they'd arrived in. 2 columns stretching for nearly a mile, moving with perfect precision down the street. Neighbors lined the sidewalks, clapping and cheering. Children waved. Adults wiped away tears. One elderly woman stood on her porch holding a sign she'd made. "Thank you for showing us what community means." As Jake led the convoy back toward Route 9, he felt something settle in his chest. This was why he wore the patch. This was what brotherhood meant. Not violence, not intimidation, but protection. Standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Being the wall between the vulnerable and those who would hurt them. His phone buzzed with messages. Local news stations wanting interviews, newspapers requesting statements, people asking how they could help or donate to Tommy's family. The story was already spreading, but more important than the media attention were the other messages he was seeing. People in the community reaching out to report other cases of abuse. Neighbors who'd been too scared to speak up before, suddenly finding their courage because they'd seen what happened when people came together. Tommy's story had sparked something. At Thompson's gas station, where the convoy had first gathered that morning, the riders reconvened one last time. They stood in a circle, hundreds strong, and Tank raised his voice to be heard. "Brothers and sisters, today we did something important. We reminded the world what we stand for. Not the stereotypes, not the negative press, but the truth that we are a family dedicated to protecting the innocent and standing against injustice." Cheers erupted from the group. "Let's make sure this isn't the last time," Tank continued. "Let's keep our eyes open. Let's be the ones who notice when something's wrong and do something about it. Today was for Tommy. Tomorrow might be for another child, another family that needs us. Are we ready?" "Yeah!" the crowd roared. As the gathering dispersed and riders headed to their respective homes, Jake stayed behind with Tank and a few close friends. They sat on the tailgate of a truck, drinking coffee and processing everything that had happened. "You know the best part?" Tank said. "It wasn't the 400 bikes or the repairs or even getting that scumbag arrested. It was seeing that kid's face when he realized he was safe, when he realized people cared. That's a memory that'll stay with him forever." Jake nodded. "He handed me a broken toy in a diner and asked for help. That's all it took. One brave moment from a scared kid. And look what happened." "Makes you think about all the other kids out there," another rider named Sam said quietly. "All the people living in fear who just need someone to notice, someone to care enough to do something. Then we keep noticing, Jake said firmly, and we keep doing something about it. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Lisa, the social worker. Tommy asked me to tell you thank you one more time. He's sleeping with that red car you gave him. First time his mother says he slept peacefully in months. You changed lives today, Jake. Never doubt that. Jake showed the message to his friends. They sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of it sink in. 3 days later, Jake received another text from Lisa with a photo attached. The image showed Tommy sitting at a table, drawing. He had a huge smile on his face, and spread around him were papers covered in colorful crayon drawings. Lisa's message explained, he's been drawing pictures of motorcycles and people helping others. His therapist says it's a healthy way for him to process what happened. He talks about you and the other riders constantly. You gave him heroes. Jake saved the photo to his phone. It became a reminder of why he did what he did. But the story didn't end there. Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened in that community. The neighbors who had witnessed the bikers' response began organizing their own neighborhood watch program. They created a support network for families dealing with domestic issues. The local community center started offering free counseling services. The woman who lived next door to Tommy's old house, a retired teacher named Margaret, started a program called Notice and Act. She gave presentations at schools and community centers about recognizing signs of abuse and how to safely report it. She always started her talks by telling Tommy's story and showing a picture of 400 motorcycles lined up on a residential street. One person noticed, she would say. One person cared enough to do something about it, and it changed everything. You can be that person too. The local news ran a feature story on the Bandidos community involvement, highlighting not just the dramatic rescue, but the club's ongoing charity work. Toy drives for underprivileged children, fundraisers for veterans, escort services for people being stalked or threatened. The stereotype of bikers as dangerous outlaws began to shift in that community. People saw them differently now. When a group of riders pulled up to a gas station or restaurant, instead of nervous glances, they received smiles and waves. Children would run up asking to see the motorcycles, and the riders would oblige, lifting kids into seats and letting them make vroom vroom noises while parents took photos. Jake found himself speaking at community events, telling Tommy's story over and over, emphasizing the same points. Pay attention to those around you. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, and never underestimate the power of people coming together for a good cause. 6 weeks after that day on Tommy Street, Jake received an invitation. Tommy and his mother had been placed in a new home in a town about 40 miles away. They'd started fresh, new jobs, new school, new life. The social services team had helped them every step of the way, and by all accounts, they were thriving. The invitation was for a small gathering at their new place. Just a few people: Jake, Tank, Officer Martinez, Lisa the social worker, and Margaret, the neighbor who'd started the advocacy program. Jake made the ride on a sunny Saturday afternoon, following the GPS to a modest but well-kept house on a quiet street lined with trees. When he pulled up, Tommy was already waiting on the front porch. The change in the boy was stunning. He looked healthy. His face had filled out a bit. His eyes were bright and full of life. He was still wearing his leg braces, but he moved with more confidence now, bounding down the porch steps as fast as he could to meet Jake. "You came! You came!" Tommy shouted, throwing his arms around Jake the moment the biker dismounted his Harley. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, buddy," Jake said, returning the hug. "Look at you. You look great." "I feel great," Tommy said, beaming. "Mom got a job at a bookstore. I'm in a new school, and the kids are really nice. And look," he pointed to the yard where a small ramp had been installed. "I can practice with my braces. My physical therapist says I'm getting stronger every week." Tommy's mother appeared in the doorway, and the transformation in her was just as dramatic. The haunted, fearful look was gone. She stood tall, smiled easily, and looked years younger without the weight of constant terror on her shoulders. "Thank you for coming," she said, welcoming Jake inside. "I wanted you to see what you helped create. This life, this safety, this happiness. It exists because you noticed, because you cared." The house was small but warm. Photos decorated the walls, Pictures of Tommy at his new school, his mother at work, both of them at a park. On the mantel sat a framed photograph that made Jake stop in his tracks. It was a picture someone had taken that day, 400 motorcycles lined up on the street, with Tommy and his mother standing in front of them. The image captured everything: hope, community, protection, love. "That's my favorite picture in the whole world," Tommy said, standing beside Jake. "I look at it every single day. It reminds me that there are good people, that there are heroes." The small gathering that afternoon was filled with laughter and stories. Officer Martinez shared updates about Rick's trial. He'd been sentenced to 12 years for multiple counts of assault and child endangerment. Lisa talked about how Tommy's case had led to increased funding for domestic violence programs in the county. Margaret described how her Notice and Act program was expanding to neighboring communities. And Tommy told them about his dreams. "I want to be a helper when I grow up," he said seriously, "like all of you. I don't know if I'll be strong enough to ride a motorcycle because of my legs, but there are other ways to help people, right?" "There are a million ways to help people," Jake said. "And Tommy, you're already doing it. You were brave enough to ask for help when you needed it. That inspired everyone you see here. You started a chain reaction of good. Don't ever underestimate the power of that." Before Jake left that afternoon, Tommy handed him something. It was a drawing. The paper showed a figure on a motorcycle, clearly meant to be Jake, with a small boy beside him holding a toy car. Above them, Tommy had written in careful, shaky letters, "My hero, thank you for saving us." Jake felt his throat tighten. He folded the drawing carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "I'll keep this forever," he told Tommy. "And whenever I need to remember why I do what I do, I'll look at it and think of you." "Promise you'll come back and visit?" Tommy asked. "I promise. And you can call me anytime. Anytime at all. You've got my number, right?" Tommy nodded enthusiastically. "It's saved in Mom's phone as Jake the Hero." Jake laughed. "I'm not a hero, buddy. I'm just a guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time." "That's what heroes are," Tommy said with the simple wisdom of childhood. "People who help when they see something wrong. That's you." As Jake rode away from Tommy's new home, the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, he felt a deep sense of peace. This was what life was about. Not the big dramatic moments, though those mattered, but the ripple effects. The way one act of kindness could transform lives, inspire communities, and create lasting change. His phone buzzed with a message from Tank. "How'd it go?" Jake pulled over to respond. "Perfect. Kid's doing great. Thriving. We made the right call." Tank's response came quickly. "We always do, brother. That's what family does." Jake smiled and pocketed his phone. He sat for a moment on his bike at the side of the road, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. In the distance, he could hear the faint rumble of other motorcycles, other riders heading home after their own journeys. The Bandidos patch on his back wasn't just leather and thread. It was a commitment. A promise to stand up for those who couldn't stand for themselves, to be the wall between the innocent and those who would do them harm, to build community through action, not just words. That evening, back at the clubhouse, Jake found himself surrounded by brothers who'd been part of Tommy's rescue. They wanted to hear about the visit, see the drawing, understand how the boy was doing. As Jake shared the story, he watched the faces around him. Men and women from all walks of life, united by a common purpose. These were mechanics and teachers, business owners and veterans, parents and artists. People who'd chosen this brotherhood because it meant something. "You know what this proves?" Tank said after Jake finished speaking. "It proves that we're not what the media makes us out to be. We're not criminals or troublemakers. We're a family that takes care of our own and protects our communities. We should do more of this," another writer named Carlos suggested. "More outreach, more visibility. Let people see who we really are." The suggestion sparked a longer conversation about community involvement. Over the next hour, the group brainstormed ideas. Monthly community rides where they'd escort vulnerable individuals who needed protection. People being stalked, domestic violence victims relocating, witnesses in danger. Expanded toy drives and fundraisers for children's hospitals and family shelters. partnership with local social services to create rapid response teams for emergency situations, educational programs at schools about bullying, standing up for others, and community responsibility. Tommy's story should be the beginning, not the end, Jake said. There are kids like him everywhere, families living in fear, people who need to know that someone notices, someone cares. The group agreed unanimously. They spent the rest of the evening drafting plans, assigning responsibilities, and reaching out to other chapters to gauge interest in expanding these programs nationwide. What had started as one biker noticing a scared child in a diner was becoming a movement. In the weeks that followed, Jake received letters and emails from people across the country who'd heard Tommy's story. Parents thanked him for raising awareness about domestic violence. Teachers shared how they'd used the story in classroom discussions about courage and community. Other motorcycle clubs reached out asking for advice on starting similar programs. But the most meaningful messages came from abuse survivors. I lived through what Tommy lived through. Thank you for showing that child that help exists. My brother didn't make it. He never found someone like you to notice. Thank you for being that person for Tommy. I was too scared to ask for help for years. Your story gave me the courage to leave my abuser. I'm safe now because of what you did. Each message reinforced what Jake already knew. Small acts of noticing and caring could change everything. 3 months after the rescue, Tommy sent Jake a video message. In it, the boy stood in front of his class at his new school, giving a presentation. The assignment had been to talk about a person who inspires you. Tommy spoke clearly and confidently. The person who inspires me is my friend Jake. He's a motorcycle rider who saw that I needed help and brought 400 of his friends to save me and my mom. He showed me that even when you're scared and you feel like nobody cares, there are people in the world who will stand up for you. Because of Jake, I learned that asking for help isn't weak, it's brave. And I learned that one person who cares can make a whole world of difference. The video ended with Tommy holding up Jake's phone number, written on a card he kept in his backpack. If you or someone you know needs help, tell someone. Be brave like I was, because there are people like Jake everywhere, waiting to help. You just have to let them know you need it. The class erupted in applause. Jake watched the video 3 times, each viewing bringing fresh emotion. 6 months after the rescue, Jake was invited to speak at a national conference on community policing and social intervention. The organizers had heard about Tommy's case and wanted him to share the story as an example of community-based solutions to domestic violence. Jake stood on stage in front of hundreds of law enforcement officers, social workers, advocates, and community leaders. He told the story from beginning to end. The diner, the broken toy, the whispered plea, the phone calls, the 400 bikers, the transformation. The key, Jake said, concluding his presentation, is creating an environment where people feel safe asking for help. Tommy didn't go to the authorities because he was scared they wouldn't believe him or couldn't protect him. But he came to me, a stranger in a diner, because something in his 7-year-old mind told him I might listen. I might care. He paused, looking out at the audience. How many Tommies are out there right now? How many children, how many adults living in fear because they don't think anyone will notice? Anyone will care. We have to be the people who notice, who care, who act. The standing ovation lasted several minutes. Afterward, dozens of people approached him with questions, suggestions, and their own stories. A police chief from another state wanted to create a similar rapid response partnership with local motorcycle clubs. A social worker asked about replicating the Notice and Act program in her community. A domestic violence survivor thanked him through tears for giving victims hope that help existed. But the interaction that stuck with Jake most was with a young officer, barely 25, who approached him hesitantly. Sir, I just wanted to say, I've been feeling discouraged lately, like nothing I do makes a difference. The system feels broken, and I've been thinking about quitting. But your story reminded me why I became a cop in the first place. To protect people, to make a difference in lives like Tommy's. Thank you for that reminder. Jake shook the young man's hand firmly. Don't quit. We need good people in every part of the system. Law enforcement, social services, community organizations, all of it. You keep being one of the good ones, and together we'll fix what's broken. The conference marked a turning point. The story of Tommy and the 400 bikers became a case study in multiple fields: social work, criminal justice, community organizing, trauma-informed care. Universities included it in curricula. Training programs used it as an example of effective intervention. But beyond the academic and professional recognition, real change was happening on the ground. The Bandidos and other motorcycle clubs across the country had embraced the model. Chapters were partnering with local organizations to create safety networks for vulnerable populations. Riders were being trained in trauma-informed approaches and legal protocols for intervention. In Tommy's original neighborhood, the transformation was permanent. The Notice and Act program had become a formal nonprofit with funding from state grants and private donations. They'd helped identify and assist 17 families dealing with abuse or domestic violence in that community alone. Margaret, the retired teacher who'd started the program, sent Jake updates regularly. She'd become something of a local hero herself, speaking at schools and community centers, training volunteers, and coordinating with law enforcement and social services. 1 year after the rescue, exactly to the day, Jake received an invitation that made him smile. It was from Tommy's school. They were holding an assembly about courage and community, and Tommy had requested that Jake be the guest speaker. The theme of the assembly was Everyday Heroes: How Small Acts Create Big Change. Jake accepted immediately. When he arrived at the school, he was surprised to see Tank and 15 other riders from that original day waiting in the parking lot. "Couldn't let you do this alone," Tank said with a grin. "We're invested in this kid too." They walked into the school together, not in full riding gear, but wearing their vests with the Bandidos patches clearly visible. Instead of the wary reactions they might have received a year ago, students and teachers smiled and waved. Several kids ran up asking questions about the motorcycles and the story they'd heard about Tommy. The assembly was held in the gymnasium, packed with students from grades 3 through 8. Tommy sat in the front row, practically bouncing with excitement when he saw Jake and the other riders enter. The principal introduced them, giving a brief overview of what had happened a year ago. Then she invited Jake to speak. Jake walked to the center of the gym and looked out at hundreds of young faces staring back at him with curiosity and interest. "A year ago," Jake began, "I was sitting in a diner eating a burger when a brave kid named Tommy walked up to my table. He was scared, he was hurting, but he was also courageous. He handed me a broken toy and told me something that changed everything." Jake proceeded to tell the story, age-appropriately adapted for the young audience. He emphasized the themes of noticing when someone needs help, having the courage to ask for help when you need it, and understanding that communities are strongest when people look out for each other. "Tommy did something incredible that day," Jake said. "He trusted a stranger to care. And because he did, his life changed. His mom's life changed. And honestly, my life changed too. Because Tommy reminded me why I wear this patch and why I ride with these brothers and sisters. It's about protection. It's about community. It's about being the person who notices and cares." He invited Tommy to join him at the front. The boy walked up, moving more confidently now after a year of physical therapy, and stood beside Jake. "Tommy, you want to tell them what you learned?" Jake asked. Tommy took a deep breath and addressed his entire school. "I learned that asking for help isn't weak, it's brave. I learned that there are good people everywhere if you know where to look. And I learned," Tommy continued, his voice growing stronger, "that one person who cares can bring 400 more. When you stand up for what's right, you're never standing alone." The gymnasium erupted in applause. Kids cheered, teachers wiped their eyes, and the principal had to wait several moments before she could restore order. After the assembly, Jake and the other riders spent time with students, answering questions and sharing stories about community service and standing up for others. They showed photos of the toy drives they organized, the charity rides they led, and the families they'd helped. One little girl, maybe 8 years old, raised her hand shyly. "Are you like superheroes?" Tank knelt down to her level. "Not superheroes, sweetheart. Just regular people who decided that helping others matters. And you know what? You can be the same kind of hero. You don't need a motorcycle or a special costume. You just need to care about people and be willing to do something when you see someone hurting." The girl's face lit up with understanding and possibility. Before they left, Tommy pulled Jake aside and handed him another drawing, this one more sophisticated than the first, showing multiple motorcycles and people helping each other in various ways. I'm going to keep drawing these, Tommy said, and when I grow up, I'm going to be someone who helps people. I haven't figured out exactly how yet, but I know that's what I want to do. You're already doing it, Jake said, by telling your story, by being brave, by showing other kids that it's okay to ask for help and that good people will answer. You're making a difference right now, Tommy. They embraced one more time before Jake and his crew headed out. As they walked to their bikes, the school principal stopped them. Thank you, she said earnestly, not just for what you did for Tommy, but for what you're doing right now. These kids need to see that help exists, that adults can be trusted. That community means something. In a world that often feels scary and uncertain, you're giving them hope. That's all any of us can do, Jake replied. Give people hope and show them they matter. The riders mounted their motorcycles and fired up their engines, a much smaller group than the 400 who'd arrived a year ago, but the meaning was just as powerful. Students pressed against the windows, waving frantically as the bikes rolled out of the parking lot. Tommy stood at the front entrance with his mother, waving until the last motorcycle disappeared from sight. That evening, back at the clubhouse, Jake sat with his closest brothers discussing the day. They'd received dozens of messages from parents at the school, thanking them for speaking to the kids and for being positive role models. You know what's wild? Carlos said, scrolling through his phone. Tommy's story has been shared on social media over 2 million times now. There are news articles, blog posts, even a podcast episode about it. This one kid's courage sparked something way bigger than any of us expected. That's the thing about truth and authenticity, Jake said. People respond to it. They're hungry for stories about good things happening, about communities coming together, about people caring for each other. We just happen to be part of one of those stories. What's next? Tank asked. We've got momentum. We've got attention. How do we use it? The question led to a long, productive conversation. The Bandidos decided to formalize their community outreach program, creating an official nonprofit arm dedicated to protecting vulnerable populations and responding to crisis situations. They'd work in partnership with law enforcement, social services, and community organizations. But they'd maintain their independent ability to act quickly when situations required it. They'd call it Tommy's Shield, named after the brave boy who'd sparked the movement. Over the following months, Tommy's Shield grew beyond anything they'd initially imagined. Chapters across the country adopted the model. They created hotlines for reporting abuse, rapid response teams for emergency situations, and ongoing support networks for families recovering from trauma. The program helped hundreds of families in its first year alone, but numbers only told part of the story. The real impact was in the individual lives changed. Children who found safety, parents who found courage to leave dangerous situations, communities that learned to watch out for their most vulnerable members. Jake received updates constantly. Photos of families who'd been helped, thank you letters from survivors, reports from social workers about improved outcomes in communities where Tommy's Shield was active. Each message reinforced the lesson he'd learned that day in the diner. Noticing matters, caring matters, acting matters. 2 years after the rescue, Jake was invited to testify before a congressional committee studying community-based approaches to domestic violence prevention. He brought Tommy with him. Now 9 years old, Tommy had grown significantly. He was taller, healthier, and more confident. His physical therapy had progressed to the point where he needed the braces less frequently, but more importantly, his spirit had healed. The fear that had haunted his eyes that day in the diner was gone, replaced by hope and determination. Tommy sat beside Jake at the testimony table, and when it was time to speak, he addressed the lawmakers directly. My name is Tommy, and 2 years ago, I was living in a nightmare. But a man named Jake noticed me. He cared enough to help, and because he did, I'm here today. I'm safe. I'm happy. I have a future. Tommy paused, looking at the committee members. There are kids like me everywhere. Kids who need someone to notice, someone to care, someone to help. The program that Jake and his friends created, Tommy's Shield, it's saving lives. Please support programs like this. Please make it easier for people to help when they see something wrong, because I'm proof that it works. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. The congressional testimony led to increased federal funding for community-based intervention programs. Tommy's shield became a model studied and replicated across the country. What had started with one biker noticing a scared child in a diner had evolved into a national movement. But for Jake, the most meaningful moments weren't the congressional hearings or the media interviews. They were the quiet ones. The text messages from Tommy sharing good grades from school, the photos of families celebrating holidays in their new safe homes, the calls from riders in other states telling him about kids they'd helped, families they'd protected. 3 years after the rescue, Jake received an invitation to Tommy's school again, this time for a different reason. Tommy had won an award for a personal essay he'd written titled "The Day 400 Heroes Saved My Life." The ceremony was small, held in the school library with Tommy's class, his mother, a few teachers, and Jake. Tommy read his essay aloud and it captured everything. The fear he'd felt living with Rick, the courage it took to approach Jake in the diner, the overwhelming emotion of seeing 400 motorcycles lined up on his street, and the transformation that followed. "I learned that heroes aren't people with superpowers," Tommy read from his essay. "They're people who notice when someone is hurting and decide to do something about it." Jake noticed me. He cared. And he brought an army of people who cared too. That's what real heroism looks like. After the ceremony, as Jake prepared to leave, Tommy's mother pulled him aside. "I never properly thanked you," she said quietly, "not just for saving us from Rick, but for giving us our lives back. Tommy is thriving. He's talking about becoming a counselor or social worker when he grows up. He wants to help other kids like himself. You didn't just rescue us that day. You gave us purpose." "You both did the hard work," Jake replied. "I just opened a door. You're the ones who walked through it and built a new life." "But you opened the door when we couldn't," she insisted. "When we felt too trapped, too scared, too hopeless to see any way out. You showed us that help existed, that people cared, that we deserved better. That changes everything." Jake hugged her, feeling the weight of her gratitude and the responsibility he'd chosen to carry. As he rode home that evening, Jake reflected on the journey. 3 years ago, he'd been a biker eating a burger in a diner, just trying to clear his head after a long week. He'd had no idea that one moment of noticing, of caring, would create ripples that extended far beyond anything he could have imagined. Tommy's broken toy car sat on Jake's mantle at home. The boy had given it to him on the 1-year anniversary, insisting Jake keep it as a reminder. Beside it sat Tommy's drawings, photos from various events, and letters from families Tommy's shield had helped. These weren't trophies. They were reminders, evidence that noticing mattered, that caring was powerful, that action created change. Jake's phone buzzed with a message from Tommy. "Thank you for coming today, and thank you for noticing me 3 years ago. I wouldn't be here without you. Literally, you saved my life and gave me a future. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to do for other people what you did for me." Jake typed a response. "You don't have to try, Tommy. You're already doing it. Every time you tell your story, every time you show other kids that asking for help is brave, every time you remind people that communities can come together, you're making a difference. I'm proud of you, kid. Keep being that light." That night at the clubhouse, Jake shared Tommy's essay with his brothers. They passed it around, reading silently, many of them getting emotional as they absorbed Tommy's words. "We should do more of this," someone said. "Not for recognition or media attention, but because this is who we are. This is what the patch means." The group agreed unanimously. Tommy's shield would continue to grow and evolve. But the core mission remained the same. Notice when someone needs help. Care enough to act. Protect those who can't protect themselves. 5 years after the rescue, Jake was invited to Tommy's middle school graduation. Now 12 years old, Tommy had been selected as one of the student speakers. He stood at the podium, confident and articulate, and spoke about resilience, courage, and community. "When I was 7, Tommy told his graduating class, "I was living in a situation that felt impossible to escape, but I found courage in a moment of desperation, and I asked for help from a stranger in a diner. That stranger, Jake, showed me what community really means. He showed me that when good people come together, they can change lives." Tommy looked directly at Jake, who sat in the audience. Because of Jake and 400 bikers who showed up when I needed them most, I'm standing here today. I'm graduating. I'm moving forward. I have dreams and plans and hope. And I've learned that my job now is to be for someone else what Jake was for me. To notice when people are hurting, to care, to act. The auditorium erupted in applause. After the ceremony, Tommy walked over to Jake, his mother beside him. They'd stayed in close contact over the years with regular calls, visits, and updates. I have something for you, Tommy said, handing Jake an envelope. Inside was a letter written in Tommy's careful handwriting. Dear Jake, 5 years ago, you saved my life. I know you say you just opened a door, but to me you were everything. You were hope when I had none. You were protection when I was vulnerable. You were proof that good people exist. I'm graduating today and moving on to high school. I'm healthy, happy, and hopeful about the future. None of that would be possible without you. I've decided what I want to do with my life. I want to work in social services, helping kids who are going through what I went through. I want to be the person who notices, who cares, who acts, just like you taught me. Thank you for being my hero. Thank you for showing me what kindness and courage look like. And thank you for never giving up on people like me. I'll carry the lessons you taught me for the rest of my life. With gratitude and love, Tommy. Jake folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket, right next to his heart. I'm proud of you, Tommy, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. You've become an amazing young man, and you're going to change so many lives. I learned from the best, Tommy replied, hugging Jake tightly. As Jake rode home that evening, the sun setting in brilliant colors across the horizon, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Life had a strange way of working out. 5 years ago, he'd been a biker having a bad week, looking for some peace over a burger. He'd had no idea that one moment of noticing, of caring, would create ripples that extended far beyond anything he could have imagined. Tommy was safe, thriving, planning a future dedicated to helping others, and all because Jake had been paying attention in a diner one afternoon, because he'd noticed a broken toy and a scared child and decided to act. That was the lesson, Jake realized. Life's most important moments often look ordinary from the outside. A child approaching a stranger, a whispered plea for help, a decision to make a phone call. But those ordinary moments held extraordinary power when met with compassion and action. Jake pulled into his driveway, dismounted his Harley, and stood for a moment in the fading light. Tomorrow he'd wake up and continue the work, responding to calls, helping families, building community. But tonight he'd rest, knowing that somewhere out there, a 12-year-old boy was sleeping peacefully, dreaming of a future where he'd help others the way he'd been helped. And that made everything worth it.